The spirits of the Gilbert and Ellice Isles communicate with Sir Arthur Grimble. The Gilbert and Ellice Isles. The Gilbert and Ellice Islands is a tiny group of islands in the Pacific Ocean. It was once a protectorate and colony of the British Empire from 1892 to 1976. The Ellice Islands became Tuvalu in 1978, and the Gilbert Islands became part of Kiribati in 1979. There were only about 30,000 people in the entire colony in the early 1900s. And it had one administrator. At the time Sir Arthur Grimble arrived to be the administrator, still in his 20s and newly married to Olivia, the islands were a Kahuna stronghold. The mystic movement of the Pacific area. Whilst on the Gilbert and Ellice Islands, he became an almost perfect Gilbertese scholar, and was said to have been the only white man not married to a native to have been initiated into this most special of mystic movements. He contributed articles on this to the journals of the Royal Anthropological Society of Great Britain and Ireland, and to the Polynesian Society of New Zealand. These articles eventually became a book, Migrations, Myth and Magic from the Gilbert Islands. About Sir Arthur Grimble. Sir Arthur Grimble, KC MG, was born in Hong Kong in 1888 and educated at Chigwell School and Magdalen College, Cambridge. In 1914, he joined the colonial service in the Pacific as a cadet and was posted to the Gilbert and Ellice Islands, where he remained until 1933, nearly 20 years. He had 4 children, all girls, some of whom were born on the Gilbert and Ellice Islands, for example, Rosemary Grimble. In 1948, Sir Arthur retired from the colonial service, having enjoyed an extremely distinguished career, and in his leisure began to jot down narratives of some of his adventures in the Gilbert and Ellice Islands. These narratives became talks on the BBC. They discovered that he not only possessed a talent for writing, but an admirable broadcasting voice as well. The result was a series of talks, which became extremely popular. The talks became a book, A Pattern of Islands, and then a 1956 film. He later wrote the companion volume, Return to the Islands. Sir Arthur died in 1956. Sir Arthur Grimble, A Pattern of Islands. There was no talk in the canoe until we had shot the big surf in the boat passage. But when we had made calm water, the native magistrate said, Suddenly, apropos of nothing, we hear Tavernier is dead. The Tavernier he meant was my old friend, the professional sorcerer of Tarawa. The death of a man like that could not fail to set the whole group talking. For there was not an island where he had not a crowd of customers for his peerless love potions and amulets. But he wasn't dead, I told the native magistrate. I had seen him only the week before, heartily enjoying the great song and dance at Tarawa. It did not seem to impress him, though. He chatted on as if I had not spoken. They say he died the day before yesterday, in the evening, of Fabo Mayona, a blow from above him. What's a blow from above him? Who says? What ship brought the news? Certainly not ours, I countered irritably. It appeared that a blow from above him meant what we might call a seizure or stroke. He did not state who had spread the rumour, but said no ship had brought it. He was bound to say that, ours was in fact the only deep-sea craft in the Gilberts at the moment. The other was down in the Ellice group. So there you are, I wound up rather pompously. It's just another silly bit of village tittle-tattle. Taoang, perhaps yes, he murmured. Taoang, meaning roughly, oh well, let it go at that, and changed the subject. The whole thing had slipped out of my mind by the time we landed. I was so used to village rumours of that sort. Nobody else mentioned Tavernier to me for the 48 hours I stayed on Onatoa. Probably the magistrate had warned everybody that the subject irritated me. In any case, it was not until I got to Arore, the last island of the southern Gilberts, that the next thing happened. It never would have happened if I had spent only a day or two there as elsewhere, but I found trouble in the place. The nature of it does not matter here. The point is, it forced me to stay. The catch left with a promise to be back in a month or so. Arore lies out in the blue, 100 miles from Onatoa. It is a lagoonless wisp of coral sand and coconuts, open on every side to the towering Pacific swells. When westerly gales sweep up at it, the huge surf bellows week-long on the weather reef, like a million driven bulls raging at the thresholds of the villages. The westerlies blew hard for most of my stay. I couldn't get away from that tortured roar, or the yelling of the coconut crests in the wind. The ceaseless, smothering din did something to my relations with the people. Somehow it seemed to be always between us. I felt very lonely among them. Perhaps that made me a good subject for a game of brown man's bluff. Bluff or not, it began when I had endured nearly a week of the place. My one familiar friend on Aurora, a retired Tarawa policeman, married to a local woman and on a visit to his in-laws, came to look me up. Tarawa men adore a comfortable chinwag, especially in their own dialect, when they are among strangers. I fancy that was what tempted him to be so extra communicative that evening. As soon as he was well seated on the guest mat, he began newsily. So, Tavernier is dead. I smiled. Now, you got that bit of gossip from Onatoa by our ship. He denied this blankly. He said he had heard it the Sunday before last. I pointed out that his timing made nonsense for me, Our ship had not even arrived at Onatoa by this date, but he persisted that our ship had nothing to do with the case. He had heard about Taberneer's death the Sunday before last from his wife's very aged and absolutely infallible kinswoman, Nai Watia. Nai Watia has another name as a baptized Christian, but for this kind of thing one must always call her Watia, he explained. What kind of thing? I naturally asked. He was too wrapped up in his main theme to answer that at once. The old woman he drove on had mentioned two important details. Taberneer had died just before sunset of a blow from above him. I rubbed it in that the phrase was precisely the one that the native magistrate of Onatoa had used, but he overrode the irony. Naturally the words are the same, he said. The news-bearers do not speak with two voices. What they reported in Onatoa, they reported to Nai Watia, also here in Aurora. This was at least good entertainment, so I asked for more about Nai Watia's exceedingly single-voiced news-bearers. It appeared they were alternatively called Ta'anei, Kanimomoi, the Whistlers. He said the Whistlers were the ghosts of dead relations, not the very long dead ones, the more recently dead. These made a constant habit of returning to the Gilberts. Their domain was the air. He called it the layer of wind, as it were, the invisible plain, just above the level of the coconut crests. At that height they flew up and down the islands, seeing and hearing everything that happened. They came lower from time to time and passed the news on to anyone alive who understood their speech. Not many people did understand it because they spoke in whistles, but Watia was an adept. She had power. She could actually order her particular ghost to come along and answer questions whenever she wanted. I took his talk for a big boast. It was only by way of calling his bluff that I asked whether his infallible relation-in-law would undertake to ask her ghost a question for me. But far from piping down, he put me on the spot instead. Of course, he replied at once. Is it indeed your wish that I should ask her? I find it was not particularly my wish, but I could not withdraw. The upshot was that he came back the next night with an invitation for me to go with him at once to Nai Watia. I followed him through the bush to a stony, treeless space above the weather beach. It was a wild night. The place was shuddering and thundering with the fury of the surf, but the moonlight flooded it starkly between racing cloud shadows. A solitary screened shack stood out in the open. 50 paces away, I saw the glimmer of a faint light through the plaited screens. He pointed. There is Nai Watia, he said. I cannot go in with you, and left me standing there. I watched him plunge back into the blackness of the bush. The thatch was so low that I could not stand upright inside. A hurricane lamp was burning on the floor. An incredibly aged face was glaring up at me round the light, almost from floor level. It had a cutty pipe in its mouth, Its lips were moving, but I heard no words. I stood there, mute, until a skeleton hand, flailing above the face, ordered me to be seated. I squatted, cross-legged as she was, on my side of the lamp, fascinated by that ruinous, wild-haired mask. The lips moved again, but the roaring of the night drowned her voice. I craned an ear forward. Then, with atrocious suddenness, the mask was convulsed and lunged up at me. She tore the pipe from her gums and shrieked into my face, "Tavernier is dead!" Nothing but that. I had not recovered from the shock of it when the whistling began. A single note, strident, like a cricket's, sounded from behind my left ear. I whipped my head around. Nobody was there. The second chirrup fell from the roof. I sprang to my feet. My head struck the ridgepole. The witch screamed with laughter, but I hardly noticed it. For the whistling was at once all around me. It wasn't harsh now, but multitudinous. It crowded in on my ears wherever I turned, as if a host of tiny, invisible birds were twittering up there in the shadows of the roof. I dived out into the moonlight and pelted round the shed. In that white glare, everything was visible. There was nobody on the roof, no tree, no sizable rock within 50 yards where anyone could be hiding. Back under the thatch, I fell on hands and knees to stare into the crone's face. Her gums were clenched, but still the twittering went on overhead. There was no break in it, even when she shouted at me, "The ancestor waits. What is your question?" The ancestor might have been her father, for all I knew. I did not ask, but shouted back at once, sprawling there on my knees. "When will the Japanese ship be returning to Aurora?" She stared at me for a long moment. "You have told us the ship will not return," she said at last. Yes, grandmother," I replied, "but perhaps I was wrong. What does the ancestor say?" Her answer was to twist her face over her huddled shoulder and howl at the roof. "The man of Matang asks when the ship of the Japan men will return." The twittering ceased. For half a minute I heard nothing but the noises of the night. Then there came a Morse-like succession of strident chirrups, followed by a dozen phrases of something like birdsong that faded gradually back into the clamour of wind and sea. "The ancestor has spoken," muttered the witch. "Count 23 days from tonight, and the ship will arrive." That ended the session. Well, so much for the whistling ghosts and their news, I said to myself outside. A mere trick of ventriloquism? Just how she could have whistled and talked at the same time, or thrown a chirrup with her mouth shut, I couldn't imagine. And I was puzzled to think why she should have said the ship would come when I said it wouldn't. I decided she'd been caught in my little trap. Perhaps I was wrong. What an old hoax, she and her precious ancestor, I thought, clinging to the hoax idea rather desperately as I groped my way home through the screaming darkness of the brush. But the fact is, Tavernier was dead, and he had died in the evening, and the cause of his death was a blow from above him, an embolism the doctor called it. He was found lying in his dwelling house at just about the time I went on board the ketch at Tarawa. The ketch lay anchored 11 miles down Lagoon from his village. Obviously the crew could have heard the news before we left next morning, but knowing how fond I was of him, they couldn't conceivably have kept the thing to themselves on our southward run had they heard it. It was the very first news they rushed to tell me when they came back to pick me up. Also, the Japanese ship did return. The prediction was a little out in point of time. She arrived on the 22nd day, not the 23rd. She came to pick up 2 coprolites, which she had left at Aurora.